Welcome to the Jaco Report. I'm Charles Jaco. It's almost like Wesley Bell was born into public service. His dad was a cop, his mom a civil servant. He was a public defender, a municipal court judge, and a municipal prosecutor. Following the Ferguson unrest, he was elected to the Ferguson City Council as a reformer, and last year he shocked the political world by ousting St. Louis County prosecuting attorney Bob McCullough. In his 27 years in office, McCullough's Law and Order Administration believed in jail over rehabilitation, except in the case of Darren Wilson, the cop who shot and killed Michael Brown. McCullough was accused of gaming the grand jury, which failed to indict Wilson. Unrest, of course, spilled into the streets and in August into the voting booths when Bell defeated McCullough. He ran on a platform of criminal justice reform. He faced an office of prosecutors who distrusted him so much that they joined the St. Louis City Police Union, a union that's been accused of racism more than once. Bell, in turn, ended up firing some prosecutors, including the one who presented the grand jury with evidence in the Darren Wilson case. It's been a busy few weeks so far, and we are very pleased Wesley Bell could take the time to join us here on the Jaco Report. Thank you very much for coming in. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I've got to bring this up because it's what everybody has been thinking about. Is there ever going to be another grand jury in the Darren Wilson case looking at whether or not he killed Michael Brown under color of law, or are you just glad enough to let that go by the wayside and not bring it up again?
You know, that's any case involving the death of someone is a very sensitive issue, and and so I am, it gives me pause, and I'm reluctant to talk about any cases and make families and victims of families, I should say, have to relive that over and over again. If they're, so we're focused on on implementing the reforms that we were voted into office to do. If there's ever anything to talk about on any cases, you'll be the first to know, Charles.
But you don't see any compelling reason right now to move a new Darren Wilson grand jury up to the front of the plate?
I mean, again, we're just focused on implementing the reforms that are going to keep St. Louis County safe.
There seems to have been a bit of turmoil in your office. We noted that right before you took office, the prosecutors in your office joined the St. Louis Police Officers Association, the city cop union that, as I noted in my introduction, has been accused of being a racist organization by quite a few people. At the same time, you came in and dismissed, I believe, 3 prosecutors. Does this indicate that there was tension, turmoil between the prosecutors who had served maybe for decades under Bob McCullough and you?
I don't think so. I think that with any transition, there's going to be changes. And when I looked at, when you look at other officials or elected officials, DAs going into office, there's usually more than the 3 changes that we made. Thus far, no one has given their notice, and so the office is running smoothly. People in that office have been welcoming and receptive and on board with our mission, which is to implement these reforms. With respect to the union, with that vote now, we're talking about of the 120 plus people in that office, we're only talking about 30 people who decided to go with this union. And let me be clear, as a former union member myself, as of just a few weeks ago, I was in the NEA Teachers Union, proud member, I should say. I support workers' rights to organize. However, the concern is the choice of union in this particular case. As prosecutors, we are, in addition to working with officers, we serve as a check on law enforcement. And not only does this choice, in my opinion, create a conflict, there's also that perception of impropriety, that perception that as prosecutors we are struggling nationwide to disassociate ourselves with the notion that we are too interdependent with law enforcement, and this sets us back. And again, let me just be clear. We support their rights to organize. It's the choice that is the problem.
Do you think they were trying to send you a message by picking this particular union, pardon me, which has, let's face it, a terrible reputation in the African American community in this town?
You know, I don't get into the symbolism or, you know, whether it was intended to send a message. The bottom line is St. Louis County residents voted for me to implement these reforms that are going to make St. Louis County safer. That's what I'm going to focus on. And the expectations, we've been very clear. I have an open door policy with the attorneys and staff, and so the expectations are set, and we give everyone opportunity to get on board with those expectations. And thus far, the reception has been amazing.
Criminal justice reform covers a pretty wide playing field with a lot of subjects. What's first among equals there for you? Of all the things that fall under the heading of criminal justice reform, what's the first thing you want to work on out of the gate?
Well, I think first and foremost, we have to understand our crime drivers. And we know that drugs, opioids, we know that the overwhelming majority of our crime is driven by indirectly or directly drugs. Those who are feeding a drug habit, committing crimes because of their drug habit or what have you. And so that's why I'm such a big proponent and advocate for expanding diversion programs. And when we talk about diversion programs, we're talking about drug treatment programs, mental health treatment programs, programs for veterans, nonviolent, low-level offenders, to give them the help that they need so that they don't progress to the violence.
I mean, your critics might ask if that is the proper role of a prosecutor's office, because while you're getting at the drivers of crime, it makes the prosecutor's office almost an adjunct to social work, dealing with underlying societal causes, drug abuse, history of family violence, PTSD from living in certain neighborhoods, whatever it might be. And they would say, no, that's not your job. Your job is to prosecute people.
And I would say if we're serious about combating the crime problem in our region, then we have to be serious about the solutions. And if we know that these social issues are a reason and a strong driver for our crime rates, then we can't dismiss the need to address those issues.
What form would the prosecutor's office involvement in this take? For example, you wanted to get more money from the St. Louis County Council to help implement these diversion programs.
Not just the diversion programs, though, Charles.
But other programs as well. But how would this work, specifically with the involvement of your office? I mean, who would be involved, and what would someone from the prosecutor's office do in that context?
Yeah, as much as I'd like to take full credit, these are programs that have been implemented throughout the country in many jurisdictions. And so what we did during our transition was a comparative analysis to the St. Louis County Prosecutor's Office with other similar situated DA and prosecutor's office across the country. And across the board, our office is sorely understaffed. And one way we can help alleviate some of these caseloads that we have, the over caseloads, I should say, is by addressing more of allocating more of our resources toward the serious and violent crimes. And so when we start implementing and bringing in community partners to help with treatment programs for nonviolent, low-level offenders who, by the way, are going to get out anyway or get probation. But what we're doing is, instead of starting that cycle of incarceration, we're treating the underlying root cause. Now, I want to make sure it's clear. We are not talking about serious and violent offenders. They have to be held accountable. We understand that, and we're continuing to do that. What we're not going to do is to continue to incarcerate the nonviolent and low-level offenders who pose no threat to our community, but instead we want to give them the treatment that they need, and that brings crime rates down. That saves taxpayer dollars, and it helps people.
Would the treatment be a function of having it adjudicated and actually going before a judge and having them ordered, or would it be something you would like to get to without even taking it to court?
We want to, all of those options are on the board. We do want to look at pre-charge diversion. So that means prior to a charge, we will offered those who are appropriate candidates, obviously nonviolent, low-level offenders, opportunities to get the treatment that they need and complete a program. And if they complete that program, then we won't charge them. And many jurisdictions are doing that. Now, there may be some that fall in different places on the continuum where the court supervision is more appropriate. And in those cases, we're working with many of the judges, including Judge Burton, who's been the champion of the alternative courts in St. Louis County. But I also have to mention our community partners, such as Affinia, Dr. Kendra Holmes, who's been just amazing with the work that she's doing with free of charge to help us connect with community partners so that organizations like Affinia will take people with grants that they've received and we can put them into those programs, and they will not cost St. Louis County residents a dime.
Now, I take it the decision not to prosecute simple marijuana possession of less than, I believe it's 100 grams, which is 3 and something ounces, was part of that. In other words, you felt that, too much time and too much jail space was being taken up by people who were getting busted for relatively small amounts of weed, or was there a larger conversation going on about how in many cases marijuana laws have been used to arrest and incarcerate people in communities of color historically?
I think everything you've said is true. One, I think and I've knocked on a lot of doors, and when we talk to people in the community, they're not worried about someone smoking a small amount of marijuana. They're worried about their family being safe. They're worried about being able to get to their job and not feel that their life could be threatened. And so we want to focus our resources on those serious and violent crimes that actually matter. The hours for an average prosecutor, I mean, we're talking upwards of 40 and 60 hours just on a case that involves a small amount of marijuana that's going to result in probation anyway. And why are we incarcerating people when we know that even a small amount of incarceration significantly increases the likelihood that someone who may not have committed a crime is going to commit a crime, or one who might have committed a low-level nonviolent crime is going to reoffend just off that small amount. And I just want to add this too, Charles, the ancillary effects of that. What we know is that people lose their jobs when they're incarcerated, even for a couple weeks. Most of us don't have jobs that'll just wait for us if we don't show up for 2 or 3 weeks. You lose your housing, the rent is due. And then if you're a single mom or a single parent, you could lose your children over something that you're looking at probation anyway, that's nonviolent, it's not a threat to the community. We can do better.
How does your proposals to reform the so-called cash bail system fit in this? First off, when one speaks of cash bail, for those in the audience who may not be familiar with the criminal justice system, what are we talking about? What's the problem with it? What's the solution in your mind?
So, just to make sure everyone understands, bail is to ensure that the accused appear throughout the criminal justice process. It is not punitive because we're dealing with people.
Or at least it's not supposed to be.
It's not supposed to be. Thank you. It's not supposed to be punitive because we're talking about people who are innocent until proven guilty. And so what's happened throughout the years is that cash has been used as the argument is that, well, we're going to have you give an amount of cash or money to ensure that you'll show up. And the problem with that system is that the murderer with means is able to buy their way out. But the low-level offender who poses no threat to someone, they're just in on the possession of marijuana, but they can't afford the $500 bond, they're stuck in jail. They lose their job, they lose their housing, and now they are more likely to reoffend on a case that they're going to get out anyway. And so what we're looking at more is a risk-based system. So if someone is a threat to the community, they are charged with a serious crime, then those people should have to stay and wait until their trial prior to getting out. And obviously if they're convicted, then they may not get out. But nonviolent, low-level offenders, why are we holding them? Now, if they don't show up and now they're a flight risk, that's a different ball game. But we're talking about someone who is getting out anyway, low-level offender. Why are we keeping them?
So what's involved in the reform of that? Do you have to convince judges, or is this an administrative decision that the prosecutor's office can make unilaterally?
So there's a couple couple components to it. One, internally, and what we implemented on day one is our internal policies in the county prosecutor's office that we would not ask for cash bond for low-level offenses. Now, there's exceptions to that if there's a threat to a victim at any time before, during, or after violence. Those are exceptions, but a non-violent low-level offender, we're not going to ask for it. Now, also the second part of that is talking to the judges and getting them on board. But also the Missouri Supreme Court is also evaluating this issue, and we're very confident that we're going to see some changes coming top down as well. And so the momentum is there. I think people understand it. The federal system does not do cash bail. Places like Washington, D.C. got rid of cash bail years ago, and there's been no increase in those people not appearing in court. So I think we can do something better that will also benefit our region as well.
These would all seem like common sense and previously tried and accepted methods in the prosecutor's office, and yet have you been facing much pushback, especially from the law enforcement community over this? You know,
what we did in the transition, day one after the primary election, is we started meeting with law enforcement across St. Louis County. Keep in mind, it's a large task because we have about 55 police chiefs. And so we started talking to them about it. And by and large, I think they get it. And, and I think with Martin Luther King's birthday just passing, I think it's apropos to talk about a woman who was charged with a nonviolent, very low-level crime and was given a $100 bond. Now, we're talking in the 60s where that's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. And for some, it's still a lot of money. And this person fortunately had a support system to bond her out, but had she not, she would have sat in jail. And we're talking about someone who just refused to give her seat up on a bus, Rosa Parks. They said $100 bond for someone like her. And what threat was she to the community? What flight risk was she? And so I think we need to reevaluate the cash bail system in a manner that effectuate what we're trying to do, and that's to make sure people appear in court, but not risking their jobs, risking their housing, and their families.
Final question. In the election that brought you in, there seemed to be a wave of criminal justice reformers, especially people of color, brought into judicial and prosecutorial positions around the country, not just here, ranging from Baltimore to Houston. What's going on here? If the wave nationally was to elect someone like a Donald Trump, the wave locally in a lot of these cities seemed to be 180 degrees like that, aimed at reforming the criminal justice system. What's going on here?
I think that people are starting to understand, when we look at our incarceration rates being the highest in the world, when we see that this supposed law and order approach has only increased violent crimes and serious crimes across the country, I think people are starting to get it. Now, I choose to believe that 2016 was the outlier and a result of a lot of people not seeing the forest for the trees and sitting at home instead of coming out and voting. And so hopefully we won't make that mistake again. And I think if the recent past is an indicator that I think we get it. And in our elections, we saw record turnouts, and hopefully that's going to be the
And I know I said that was the final question, but I lied.
That's okay.
That just led me to think there has been a resurgence in racism and white nationalism, almost on an institutional level, around the country since the Trump election. And I find the disconnect between that and the criminal justice reform taking place on local levels to be absolutely fascinating. It's almost looked like you're dealing with two different countries.
Yeah, unfortunately, our president has empowered many of these individuals with these just horrendous beliefs towards people who are different. And I don't want to hear that this is political correctness, because really political correctness is about decency. That's all it is. Let's be decent to one another. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. But hopefully people understand the power of the ballot box, and that we can't take off elections, and that they have consequences. And so we're going to make sure that we preach that gospel, and so that 2016 never happens again.
St. Louis County Prosecutor Wesley Bell, thank you
My
very
pleasure.
much for coming in. I appreciate it. Our thanks to Prosecutor Wesley Bell, and as always, our thanks to you for joining us here on the Jaco Report. We hope you'll be with us here next week when we return with the next edition of the Jaco Report.